let me introduce Dr. Timpson. Annis May Timpson received her first degree in 1977, a BSc in Politics and Social Administration from Bristol. She went on to do an MSc in Social Policy and Social Research at Oxford and completed that degree in 1979. Moved on to do a PhD in Political Science at the University of Toronto and graduated in 1997. For some time, she has been a senior lecturer at the School of Social and Political Science at Edinburgh, the director of their Centre for Canadian Studies. She is currently an academic visitor at the University of Oxford. And Annis May is here as a candidate for the directorship of MISC. And I think without further ado, I would ask her to begin her presentation, and we'll have time for questions once Dr. Timpson has finished her presentation. Thanks.
Okay, merci, thank you. I'll just switch it now to content. This should work, I hope. Right, I just hope this is going to... Just seems to have... this should work now. It'll just... Yeah. Can you see my screen, my slides there beginning? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues et étudiants, je suis très heureuse d'être avec vous aujourd'hui et je tiens à vous remercier de m'avoir invité à l'interview pour le poste de directeur du MISC. C'est un privilège d'avoir cette occasion de vous présenter mes idées pour la gestion du MISC dans la prochaine phase du développement des études canadiennes à McGill. We're at a fascinating moment in Canada's development with an energetic new federal government in power that is engaging with the academic community and regenerating significant international interest in Canada. This places MISC, a publicly facing institute within Canada's leading internationally renowned University of McGill, in a very strong position to engage nationally in key conversations about Canada and internationally in deliberations that bring Canadian insights and experience to issues of international importance. I've been involved in Canadian studies internationally for over 3 decades. I'm passionate about Canada's development and strongly committed to promoting informed dialogue about the country. In addition, I'm delighted to be presenting my profile at McGill. It's the very first university I ever heard about, as my mother graduated from McGill in 1950 as a beneficiary of Mackenzie King's post-war initiatives to promote university education. Let's think, as you've asked me to do, first of all, about the national agenda. I anticipate that 6 key issues will dominate Canada's national agenda in the coming decade. Renewed interest, first of all, in Canada's leadership as a multicultural nation that champions diversity and human rights, particularly in the context of the current engagement in the humanitarian initiatives around the Syrian refugee crisis. I think, however, questions remain about how Canada will balance this contribution with its international engagement on issues of global security. Long-term work to implement the calls for action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly following the publication of the report yesterday. And this will require development of culturally sensitive relationships between Indigenous communities and the state. Environmental questions, especiellement en ce qui concerne les engagements internationaux à Paris le week-end dernier, that have profound social and economic implications given Canada's resource-based economy and its historic reliance on fossil fuels. And concerns about restructuring the economy and promoting innovation in the context of technological change, particularly given Canada's engagement now in trans-Pacific partnerships. Les débats clés de l'avenir des rapports Québec-Canada qui seront formés par l'histoire nationaliste et fédéraliste, le contexte changeant des rapports fédéraux provinciaux, la croissance des communautés culturellement diverses, au Québec et les changements technologiques qui mettent en valeur l'engagement bilingue et global de la jeunesse québécoise. And finally, I think there will be moments of national reflection, particularly between 2017 and 2020, as Canada marks its 150th anniversary, Montreal its impressive 375 years. And women around the country reflect back and think forward, 50 years on from the massive exercise in public engagement brought about by Lester Pearson's appointment of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1967 and its report in 1970. There's potential for MISC to become involved in national conversations about all of these issues and to do so in different ways. Comme directrice de l'Institut, je travaillerai avec mes collègues et avec le conseil d'administration pour assurer que les initiatives du MISC s'accordent avec les recherches stratégiques et les priorités pédagogiques de McGill et qu'elles assurent sont réellement efficaces auprès du public. I would prioritise 5 things, 5 key approaches in so doing, and I would like to talk to you about those now. First, I think MISC's successful annual conferences should remain a core feature of the Institute's agenda, with output promoted online to enable global knowledge mobilisation. And just as MISC in 1997 hosted a really significant conference forging a new relationship in response to the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I, as Director of the Centre of Canadian Studies at Edinburgh, organised First Nations First Thoughts in 2005 to move beyond the debate provoked by Tom Flanagan's book. As Director of MISC, I would set up my first MISC conference in 2017 to look back at what has and has not been achieved in the 20-year period since RCAP and consider how effectively communities and governments are now going to address the TRC's important calls for action. Secondly, I'd work in consultation with colleagues in political science at the Institute for Health and Social Policy, the Centre for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism at McGill, and its Office of First Nations and Inuit Education in the Faculty of Education, to set up what I would call MISC policy seminars. And through these bring practitioners and academics together to facilitate policy innovation and enhance graduate student experience in a potential new McGill MA in public policy. Topics could include the effectiveness of Canada's approach to the Syrian refugee crisis and the long-term implications of Canada's humanitarian initiatives now within Quebec, the difficulty of building a national policy for health and social care, given the pressures of an ageing population in the Canadian South and a burgeoning youth population in the Canadian North. L'impact des rapports Québec-Ottawa sur les développements clés de politique à la nouvelle ère Trudeau, par exemple par rapport à la déclaration récente du gouvernement fédéral au sujet de l'amélioration de l'offre d'enseignement des Premières Nations. Thirdly, I'd like to work with colleagues at McGill Queen's University Press and within the Faculty of Arts to create, from small beginnings perhaps, an academic book festival and Festival de Livres Académiques at MISC that gives voice to the authors of new academic books published on Canada each year. This would provide a wonderful opportunity for McGill students and colleagues to hear new authors in person, for scholars and publishers to promote their work to broader public audiences, potentially with coverage from the CBC and Radio-Canada, et pour que le MISC soit identifié comme un lieu où la nouvelle littérature académique, publiée et en français et en anglais, sera promue et glorifiée. Fourth, I would work to develop collaborative interdisciplinary research to emphasise MISC's leadership of the Indigenous Studies programme at McGill. Leading scholars from McGill, Quebec and Canada, in partnership with Indigenous organisations in Nunavut and Nunavik, build a new research initiative under the Aboriginal Peoples section of SSHRC's Future Challenges programme that would be designed to examine Indigenous-led innovations in the structure of public services and the provision of education, health and social services, for example, in Nunavut and Nunavik, and initiatives to preserve the Inuit language and dialects spoken in these two regions. And this would be with a view to understanding how initiatives in these regions could enhance the development of indigenously sensitive approaches to public administration and public policy in other regions of Canada, and contribute to Canadian and to global initiatives in the preservation of Indigenous languages, potentially also leading gradually, I think and hope, to a more dynamic and inclusive understanding of official languages in Canada. And finally, I would want to encourage the initiatives to enhance opportunities for Indigenous students to engage in post-secondary education through the Indigenous Studies programme at MISC, working with colleagues at McGill and with Indigenous partners to consider how MISC can best work on campus and at a distance to enhance the engagement of Indigenous students in community-based tertiary education informed by Indigenous methodology in teaching, learning and assessment. Comme directrice, j'ajouterai aux fondations solides du MISC, à son avantage relatif comme centre des études du Canada, soutenu par les dons généraux de la Fondation Bronfman et la famille Eakin. And I would take advantage of McGill's national and international reputation, its capacities to engage with both official language communities, and its location at the heart of a dynamic North American city that national and international experts want to visit. In leading MISC, I would draw on my track record of designing, directing and publishing the output of international conferences, working with colleagues at McGill to host a variety of conferences that meet their diverse research interests. Organising policy seminars, perhaps using Chatham House rules from the UK, as I did when, for example, former Prime Minister Joe Clark visited the centre at Edinburgh. I would also bring my skills in galvanising colleagues into collaborative research initiatives, as I did when I set up research hubs at Edinburgh on Quebec and Scotland on the one hand, and indigeneity research in Scotland on the other. And these connected scholars, graduate students and practitioners, nationally and internationally. I would also work on my track record of building a successful visiting scholars programme at Edinburgh and using this experience to identify how MISC's visiting scholars could contribute to key research areas in McGill's strategic research plan. Et comme beaucoup d'entre vous, j'apporterai à ce poste de l'expérience considérable d'avoir établi des liens avec les médias nationaux et internationaux. And I would build on the impressive public engagement of previous MISC directors to ensure that the Institute remains a go-to place for public commentary, nationally and internationally. And finally, I would bring experience and enthusiasm about promoting student learning through active community engagement. For example, in my earlier academic post at Sussex, I brought leading social movement activists into the classroom to enable students to assess the impact of North American social movements on feminist gay rights, civil rights and disability rights movements in Britain. De plus, je me suis procuré des fonds de l'extérieur pour permettre aux étudiants d'interviewer des diplomates et des journalistes canadiens à Londres, comme partie de leur travail évalué, pour qu'ils aient pu comprendre comment ils pourraient appliquer de manière pratique ce qu'ils avaient appris en classe sur la politique canadienne. At Edinburgh, I worked in partnership with National Museums Scotland to enable graduate research internships and undergraduate knowledge mobilisation projects. Students use their learning on Northern Canada to suggest ways in which the National Museum could enhance its displays about Indigenous communities in the Canadian North. Les compétences que j'ai développées en gérant ces initiatives sont celles que j'apporterai à ma direction du MISC. Pour que les étudiants qui suivent les programmes d'études canadiens et d'études indigènes puissent s'adresser aux activistes dans la communauté, aux politiciens et juste de l'autre côté de la rue de McGill, des possibilités de mieux comprendre les rapports indigènes colonisateurs au musée Mercure. Vous avez posé des questions importantes sur la fondation du MISC par rapport au débat sur l'unité nationale au milieu des années 90. J'ai suivi ces débats attentivement et comme membre d'une équipe de 4 personnes financée par le Haut Commissariat du Canada à Londres, j'ai eu l'occasion d'interviewer les leaders d'opinion à Ottawa, au Québec, ainsi qu'en Colombie-Britannique et en Alberta, au sujet de la politique du référendum. Les débats publics sur l'unité nationale et la souveraineté dans les années 90 étaient profonds. Il est important que le MISC s'oriente vers l'avenir tout en tenant compte de l'expérience des années 90. Questions of national unity and Quebec sovereignty may not be high on the agenda at present, but they are part of political culture in Canada and could intensify in the future. I observed the 1980 and 1995 referendums closely and, in addition, have interesting comparative experience from Scotland's referendum in 2014. As a leading institute for the study of Canada located in Quebec, MISC should provide an environment for informed debate on these issues. For example, through opportunities for research and research-led teaching on the history of the 1980 and 1995 referendums and the national unity questions surrounding them, and by bringing informed reflection on Canadian experience to analysis of national unity and sovereignty debates in Europe. However, in promoting understanding of Canada as a pluralistic society, MISC should also continue to develop research and teaching about diverse, Indigenous, settler and regional foundations of Canada, and both the theoretical and the creative responses to the issues faced by these different communities. And I think it would be valuable also for MISC to develop in the future its Indigenous Studies programme, so that in time this becomes an undergraduate major. And MISC also provides opportunities for graduate work in Indigenous and Canadian Studies at McGill. J'ai une large gamme de qualifications professionnelles qui me prépareront à gérer efficacement le MISC. First, I have a breadth of knowledge of Canada developed through research at federal, territorial and provincial levels of government. This includes my prize-winning work on federal approaches to questions of gender equality in employment. My book, Driven Apart, examined why, despite feminist activism and recommendations of 2 royal commissions, policies to promote gender equity in employment and childcare were subject to uneven treatment in the federal policy arena. I've been actively engaged at the territorial level since 1998 in research on political development and public policy in Nunavut. This work examines the bureaucratic dynamics of dividing the Northwest Territories and the complexities of developing an Inuit-informed approach to governance and public policy that meets the objectives of public governance on the one hand and reflects Inuit knowledge, language and culture on the other. And I've also carried out key research at the provincial level, which includes in my earlier work a focus on the Ontario childcare movement in the 1980s, interviews, as I mentioned, in Quebec, British Columbia and Alberta in the run-up to the 1995 referendum in Quebec, and a significant contribution on Nunavut's engagement as a new public government in intergovernmental relations, which involved me in interviews in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec and PEI. Second, allow me to say that my depth of understanding of Canada stems not only from this research history, but from regular travel throughout the country, beginning as a graduate student when I cycled solo between northern BC and Newfoundland. And throughout my professional career, I've been actively engaged in promoting the study of Canada internationally, setting up Canadian studies within American and Canadian studies at the University of Nottingham and Sussex in the mid-1980s and 1990s, serving as Vice President of the British Association for Canadian Studies and creating the first database of Canadian research and teaching in the UK in the mid-90s, directing the Centre of Canadian Studies at Edinburgh for over 10 years, and while I was there, founding and directing the Canadian Studies PhD programme at Edinburgh, attracting UK, European and Canadian students to the programme ahead of target. I could bring that success to MISC to develop an interdisciplinary PhD programme in Indigenous Studies and Canadian Studies. And given McGill's membership of Universitas 21, I could also work potentially to link such programmes with a range of international universities, also belonging to U21. Fourthly, I've got substantial experience of building academic communities nationally and internationally. I've built very strong relations with Quebec colleagues through the MCRI project on Indigenous Peoples and Governance led by Pierre Noreau and Jeremy Weber, and through engagement with Dialogue and the new SSHRC partnership project led by Carol Levesque on the Aboriginal world and the challenges of living together. As director of MISC, I would be well connected with a range of colleagues at all universities in Montreal. And I'm also skilled at building research hubs and collaborative teaching arrangements within universities, as I did at Edinburgh, expanding the reach of the centre to include colleagues working in comparative fields and involving colleagues visiting scholars and graduate students in research-led teaching at the centre. And fifthly, I have a significant track record of building community partnerships and facilitating public outreach. At Edinburgh, I built partnerships with the Scottish Poetry Library and UNESCO City of Literature to host Canadian writers. And I'd hope to do likewise at MISC, for example, by partnering with Faire Montréal to reflect on creative responses, perhaps, to Canada that will likely emerge, I'm sure, with the new Syrian refugee community in Montreal. And as MISC Director, I would take forward my experience of organising 100 conferences, open research seminars and public lectures at Edinburgh, including lectures, for example, by Mary Simon, Ed Broadbent and Sean Atleo when he was National Chief of the AFN. I have also substantial experience of fundraising, which includes raising funds through research and programme development grants to support a range of colleagues' work and conference sponsorship, working with the Foundation of Canadian Studies in the UK to secure a major donation from the Jessamine Foundation in Winnipeg, building alumni relations as I did at Edinburgh and I continue to do at Linacre College, where I'm now based in Oxford. And I would take these skills and work closely with MISC trustees and McGill's Development Office, looking closely at effective ways to cultivate long-term relations with MISC alumni, so that MISC develops an intergenerational feel about it, where alumni retain connections and current students have career-enhancing connections with those who studied before them at the Institute. And finally, on this section, I'd like to point out that I have substantial administrative experience of running a Canadian Studies Centre, which includes developing and implementing strategic plans to meet objectives of external benefactors and the university, serving on school management teams and the university's North American Regional Strategy Committee, appointing, managing and working together with support staff, sessional instructors and teaching assistants, and knowing that as an effective director, one sets and achieves manageable targets, responds quickly when opportunities arise, draws on the administrative expertise of support staff, seeks to enhance students' career opportunities, and, above all, ensures that the Institute is a dynamic and welcoming place for all who engage in it. I'm trained, as Hudson said, in political science and social policy, but my background has also academically been shaped by the benefits of a Commonwealth scholarship that first brought me to Canada as a doctoral student, and by then teaching Canadian studies at four UK universities in interdisciplinary contexts. I have a very strong commitment to multidisciplinary teaching, supervision, scholarly collaboration and outreach. I participate regularly in the Congress of Humanities and Social Science conferences and serve on the editorial board of leading Canadian studies journals, as well as journals of public politics and public policy. As I've put here on my record of publications, they include prize-winning work on women's employment equality, a book on political culture in contemporary Britain developed in conjunction with the Canadian Charter Project at the University of Toronto, First Nations First Thoughts, described by Alan Cairns as a book that has no rival in its search for reconciliation, and a recent edition of Nouvelles Pratiques Sociales, co-edited with Karine Jean-Telet at the Université de Montréal. But what about my current and future research? My current research interests that I would bring to MISC focus on Indigenous and settler language relations in Nunavut. This work focuses on complex politics of developing and implementing new language policies in Nunavut that take account of official languages legislation that Nunavut inherited from the GNWT, imperatives of the Federal Nunavut Act that require new language legislation in the territory to ensure the protection of the Francophone minority in Nunavut, and key questions about protecting from erosion the Inuktitut and Inuit Nukten variants of the Inuit language spoken in different regions of Nunavut. The research raises important questions about constitutional obligations to Indigenous and settler communities within the territory, arising on the one hand from the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement and on the other hand from charter obligations to official languages communities. I'm planning, as part of my work for the new SHIRK project on the Aboriginal world and the challenges of living together, to take this work forward by looking at the dynamics of implementing the Inuit Language Protection Act and the Official Languages Act in different regions of Nunavut. In addition, I am developing with a team of Canadian feminist scholars in a partnership development grant that we've just submitted to SHIRK, a project that is scheduled to coincide with the run-up to the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada designed to engage women in dialogue about key issues 50 years on gender justice. And through this work, I hope, if we are successful with the application, to be able to focus in partnership with ITK and Paugtutit on Inuit women's engagement in the project, and to write also reflecting back to my earlier work about the way concepts of gender justice have changed in the 50 years since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. But in the longer term, I do have potential future research interests. The first is to conduct a study of the contributions of language commissioners in Canada to civil society as Canada begins to move beyond its formal adherence just to 2 official languages and address the importance of protecting and recognising Indigenous languages and also in different ways multicultural diverse languages spoken in Canada. Secondly, potentially I would be interested in working with colleagues in pursuing comparative work on the politics of engagement with Indigenous communities in the 3 territories. This is a huge topic, and one would involve careful consideration about the most appropriate ways to focus work in order to explore fundamental distinctions between Yukon, Northwest Territories and the Nunavut government's engagement with Indigenous communities in each territory. And thirdly, I have long been interested in the way women have been constructed in key royal commissions that have not either been designed or not been designed with a specific gender focus. There certainly is an important archival project waiting to be developed in this area that would enable us to understand the articulation of women's histories through public inquiries in Canada. As a committed, research-led university educator who enjoys teaching enormously, I would wish to contribute to teaching at MISC. Le poste m'attire puisqu'il offre l'occasion d'enseigner des programmes d'études canadiens et des études indigènes qui sont au cœur de mes recherches. I would, as I show in this PowerPoint, bring to MISC a wide experience of teaching, but thinking about what I could potentially offer, I would be very interested in offering courses in Canadian studies that focused on the dynamics of a multicultural state in Canada, as a course that combined analysis of Canadian theories of multiculturalism, the historical development of negotiation in a multicultural state in Canada, contemporary tensions around multiculturalism, and the opportunity for students to enhance their citizenship skills through project work. Within the Indigenous Studies programme, I would be interested in developing my course that I've already taught at Edinburgh on Indigenous politics, culture and screen in Canada, which enables students to think about cultural self-determination in a variety of Indigenous communities and screen contexts, including film, video, television and digital communication. I noted in my application, as I've listed here, the Northern Canadian politics, language politics and public policy, and social movements and policy change courses that I could potentially develop in political science. And I would also plan to bring to MISC my successful experience in building conferences where students at undergraduate and graduate levels can present their dissertation work in public and gain feedback from academics and external commentators invited to give keynote addresses at such events. In the second and third cycles, I would, in addition, be interested in working with colleagues at McGill to develop a new MA, as I said, in international Indigenous governance and in public policy, potentially linking these degrees, if possible, to involve Universitas 21 partners in Australia, New Zealand and Scandinavia. And finally, as I noted, I would hope in the course of my directorship to develop a doctoral programme in Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies at MISC. I've mentioned a lot of natural partners in the course of my presentation, and in any institutional context these mutate. But in this PowerPoint I hope that I show you that I'm thinking about potential partnerships within the Faculty of Arts and beyond the Faculty of Arts. And I'd like to emphasise to you that I consider it important as Director of MISC to build excellent relations with McGill's First Peoples House and also with the Advancement Office for Development and Alumni. But I would also be sure to build strong collegial relationships with Institute trustees, staff, academic colleagues and affiliates and visiting scholars, and cultivate relations with colleagues at McGill who may become connected to MISC for a specific reason. For example, a conference on environmental issues, a francophone section of the literature festival I propose, or a specific Econ lecture. And in so doing, my purpose would be to build collaborative relations and think about how those connections could be developed to benefit MISC and its students, as well as to foster local, national and the international objectives of McGill. Les études canadiennes fournissant un domaine fascinant qui est en constante évolution dans l'éducation des arts libéraux. I've had the privilege to date of developing that focus in an international context. And like my students, I'm able to evaluate my own citizenship more carefully as a result. In course evaluation, students have repeatedly said how their engagement in the interdisciplinary area studies focus of Canadian studies enhances their work in core degree subjects. And this is also the case for many researchers. Les études canadiennes en Canada auront un accent différent des études canadiennes au Royaume-Uni. Parce qu'en général, les étudiants ont bénéficié de l'étude de l'histoire, de la géographie, de la politique et de la société canadienne avant d'entrer en faculté. And against this background, Canadian Studies provides a multidisciplinary approach to understanding the multinational base and continuous processes of development and identity negotiation within Canadian society. Canadian Studies also provides students with a strong context in which to enhance their skills in local, national and global citizenship, to appreciate intercultural negotiation and take those skills forward for the greater social good beyond their time at university. As Director of MISC, I would champion Canadian Studies within arts education at McGill and in heading up this key institution for the study of Canada, build relations with Canadian and Quebec-focused units at McGill, with other universities in Montreal, and with Canadian Studies programs in Canada and more broadly in the Americas and Europe. Under my direction, I would want MISC to remain an international centre for the study of Canada, recognised throughout Canada and globally. Pour conclure, j'aimerais encore une fois vous remercier de m'avoir accordé du temps pour vous présenter un peu la vision que j'ai du travail de la directrice de l'Institut. Je suis convaincue que j'aimerais énormément travailler avec vous à Montréal au sein de l'Institut des études canadiennes à McGill. I look forward to your questions and thank you once again for inviting me to present my ideas for leading MISC and the future development of Canadian studies and Indigenous studies at MISC.
Thank you. We have lots of time for questions. Can you hear me, Anis?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just hoping this will now switch off. I believe you will see me in a minute.
Oh, we see you.
We see you.
Yep.
We see you.
Yeah, I see you now. That's great. Okay, good. Fantastic.
Dr. Timpson,
Thank you.
we're in multiple sites. I think I might ask individuals here at McGill at the table if they have any questions first, and then I might inquire about those at other sites. Any questions here to Dr. Timpson? Daniel Weinstock.
So, hello, good to see you.
Hi.
So let me ask you a very direct question, which I think is something that must be on your mind. You're obviously you have qualifications that qualify you for the directorship. How do you see the challenges of coming to McGill to run an Institute for the Study of Canada from outside of the country? Do you think that you would have what are the issues that you think you'd have to face in terms of convincing colleagues, convincing the broader community that this was the best option, sort of going outside the country to recruit a director? It's something that I'm sure that you've thought about, and might as well put the issue right out on the table.
Absolutely,
So was that
and
blunt?
it's a very fair question. I think, first of all, I'd just like to say that should I be successful in this appointment, I'd work cooperatively with officials at McGill to go through the procedures that would be necessary for my appointment. And I'd also just like to say personally that I would have the support of my family and my husband in making this application and moving to Canada. But the bigger question,
just to be clear, it wasn't at all a personal question about whether your family.
No, but I wanted
Right.
to put that on the table. Yeah, sure. But I think it's important to say that this is a very fair question in terms of the strategic position of appointing somebody from outside. I think it is really important to think about Canada internationally and the advantages that can be brought by somebody coming from outside but who has an intimate knowledge of Canada, working at MISC and taking forward the direction of MISC with an international framework. And I think that reinforces for students and for researchers the fact that Canadian studies is not just something studied in Canada. It's something in which people internationally are very engaged in. And I think it's also important to say that, as I intimated personally and professionally, I've been very involved in the study of Canada for the last 30 years and have a very intimate knowledge of it and a notion of being very connected with colleagues in Canada. And so I would not be coming in any way to a strange place, a strange city, a strange university. These are familiar to me. And I believe that I would adjust very easily to the environment at McGill, and I relish the opportunity to do that. But I think it's important to say that I would constantly reinforce, respectfully, the fact that I have come from outside and that I would be bringing to McGill a range of experiences and a range of perspectives. And I would always be respectful to you and to colleagues at McGill that I've brought that experience and that I have lots to learn from you, as well as hopefully for us to share as a result of my experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jane Everett.
Thank you, Dr. Timpson, for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I was very interested to re-see the range of your interests. Je vous remercie également d'avoir fait une partie de votre présentation en français. Et ma question s'adresse à votre compétence en français. Il y avait très peu de fautes dans ce que vous avez fait, donc je vous félicite. Mais je me demandais si vous vous sentez vous-même tout à fait à l'aise en français. Est-ce que vous pouvez, dans une conversation avec des francophones, est-ce que vous vous sentez tout à fait à l'aise pour comprendre tout ce qu'on vous dit et pour répondre en français comme il faut?
Oui, j'ai compris ce que vous avez dit et je veux dire que j'ai appris le français depuis que j'ai eu 7 ans et j'ai fait la pratique en français plusieurs fois en France et au Canada. La vérité, je pense, c'est que je suis assez confortable de bavarder, de parler comme ça en conversation. J'aime beaucoup parler français, ça m'intéresse beaucoup. Mais je pense que si je gagne cet emploi que je veux beaucoup, je veux en avance d'arriver à McGill, faire des cours en Angleterre, en français. En anglais, on dit hit the ground running, hein, parce que je veux être très fort, et spécialement, pas seulement pour parler avec les collègues, mais aussi pour engager avec la communauté des affaires à Montréal. Parce que je connais que c'est très important que le directeur de MISC peut faire ça. Alors, si je gagne l'emploi, je veux beaucoup faire des cours pour être fort en français quand j'arriverai.
Merci beaucoup.
Bill Watson.
I just wanted to ask about where your passion about Canada came from, and I also wanted to ask about the bike trip.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
That was my question.
it sounded as if you took a northern route, or did you start in northern BC, come south, and then go across on the south? I wasn't aware there was a northern route. How did it happen? Tell us a little bit about it. And I assume that led in part to your passion. First, you have to be passionate to do it, but I assume it reinforced your passion somewhat.
Yeah. Well, just if I could say, maybe I'll start with the bike trip, or trips, in fact. But in time I had to say it carefully. But basically, what I saw as important when I was a graduate student at Toronto was that I spent some time out of Robarts Library, and I am so glad I did this. Because what I noticed with students was that they were staying in Toronto all the time. And I wanted to be out of Toronto as well. And so I decided
we all do.
But I decided that it would be good over 3 summers to kind of divide southern Canada in three. And in the first summer, I cycled from Toronto to St. John's in Newfoundland. And in the second summer, I've missed a tiny bit. I've cycled from Banff up to Prince Rupert and then down to Victoria. And then in the third summer, I cycled from Regina back to Toronto. So you can see the bit I missed between Regina and Banff. Right. But it's to do with airports and travel. But what I think that did, which was just so important to my career in Canadian studies, is that it gave me the experience of understanding the different regions of Canada, the different dialects of Canada, the different communities of Canada, and the different sensibilities of people. And I think the fact that I travelled on my own was really important, because I then became much more attuned to kind of sensibilities that are around and possibilities of engaging with people than I think you do when you travel in a group. And I think that this experience was incredibly important. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One example in New Hazelton in northern British Columbia, or near there, which I returned to with my husband some 25 years later, actually, and it was interesting to see the changes. That when I was very near that community in the early 1980s, people said to me, "You're really stupid to cycle through that Aboriginal community, that reserve that's coming up on the highway. Don't do it." And I had no choice, because I was continuing to go through. And what I found was, when I went to that Aboriginal community, and when I stopped in that Aboriginal community and talked to the people concerned there, I learnt about what kinds of issues in the early 1980s that community was facing culturally and sort of socioeconomically. I got a sense of it. And I think that is really, really important. By contrast, on my very first trip out of Toronto, and I listened to a tape I'd done of this in preparation for the interview, in my very first campsite, because I camped doing this, which was kind of in southern Ontario, I guess somewhere between Toronto and Kingston, I actually camped next to a Sikh family who lived in Toronto. And the man in that family had cycled throughout India on a three-wheeled bicycle, and had had 410 punctures and 7 marriage proposals. So I only had 2 punctures, but nonetheless, it gave me a sense immediately that I was dealing with a diverse community. And I think that's just two small examples. One very quick third example is, I'll never forget, in the middle of Saskatchewan, having to stop in a small community with only a Chinese takeaway and a church open, because I was burning up on the prairie. And the only way I could do that was to sit in the church for the afternoon in order to keep cover. But I mean, my passion for Canada more broadly, right, that's part of it. But my passion for Canada and for teaching Canadian studies has to do with what I talked about at the end of this presentation. It's to do with my fascination of working in a country, or working in relation to a country and different parts of the country that actually is constantly renegotiating itself. And I find it so interesting when I'm teaching as well as when I'm doing my research. I mean, in Britain, we're renegotiating our relationship potentially with Europe at the moment, but you don't have the layers of renegotiation that happen in Canada. For example, with the new issues in the last sort of 10, 15 years happening in Nunavut, with the entry of a new jurisdiction, with the questions now around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of negotiations happening around multiple Indigenous communities wanting to seek different routes to reconciliation. These are very important and very interesting questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Timpson, we also have some members of the administrative and support staff from MISC, and I think one of that dedicated group would like to ask a question.
I'm going to stand up. I'm here in the corner. Hi, I'm Monica Dedich. I'm the Communications Administrator at MISC currently.
Hi, Monica.
Thank you for delighting us for your very eloquent presentation. I definitely, as a communications person, I enjoy very well thought out and well expressed presentations, so thank you. My question was relative to funding and any funding strategies you might have thought of. You mentioned developing a strong relationship with the University Advancement and Alumni Relations offices, as well as developing partnerships with other local players. But more specifically, have you thought of other strategic partnerships that are perhaps a bit alternative to these more traditional public domain funding sources?
Yeah. Well, I have thought about that, and that's why I mentioned SHIRK, and I mentioned the way in which we might deal with research councils. But I think it's important because I'm aware that your conferences have had multiple funding supports, and I'm aware of the kind of routes that you've gone through. And I think it would be very important in coming to MISC and coming to Montreal to think about where you've had success and where there have been difficulties. And I would see it as very important very early on in my role as director to identify where those greatest successes have been, or where potential new successes have been. And I think it's also important, if we're thinking, for example, on the question of the conference I suggested setting up in 2017 on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether there might be particular possibility of funding through Aboriginal councils or national organisations for part of that, or also given the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate to the business community to engage in reconciliation, it seems to me that this may be a very clear potential way for members of the business community in Montreal or in Quebec more generally to show those kind of colours, as it were, of supporting that kind of move towards reconciliation. But I think it's also important, and I've thought about this carefully before the interview, you've got a fantastic board of trustees, and I'm not just saying that because I'm in an interview. I've really enjoyed reading the biographies of the trustees. And the trustees have a wealth of information and expertise in civil society organisations and a range of expertise in terms of gaining understanding of who might be potential new funders through their organisations. And I would see it as very important to work with the trustees to think about key partnerships that could be developed in relation to specific projects. And I think one of the things you have to do as director is to think about what are the specific goals you want to develop and what are the funding objectives that meet those goals. And in addition, lastly, one of the things that I would particularly like to think about, given that MISC is, coming of age at 21 now, is that we could think about a 25th anniversary celebration, which after all would have alumni from MISC who could be identified and who may want to support that particularly. And it may even be possible at that stage, they're slightly young, but might be possible to think about developing a legacy circle for those MISC alumni to think about longer term contributions to the Institute.
Thank you.
Annis, could I ask a question about your recent academic history? You're just completing a kind of career transition. You left Edinburgh. You're now an academic visitor at Oxford. What motivated the decision to leave Edinburgh? And what exactly is an academic visitor in the Oxford nomenclature?
Yeah, there was an opportune moment for me to leave Edinburgh, and I decided to do so. And I think I have to talk cautiously in public forums, and I ask you to respect that this is said in sort of good spirit. But the Centre of Canadian Studies at Edinburgh does not have the same kind of foundation that the university, McGill University, has for MISC, and so I had to deal with quite significant complications around long-term funding of the centre. And the University of Edinburgh, for which I respect them, had to make decisions about reducing the role of the director within that context, because external funding, was not as strong as it had been when it had its original foundation. I have re-engaged with Linacre College, where I undertook my master's degree at the University of Oxford, because it has a system that applications can be made for visiting academics, for continuing members, if they are research active, to actually regain a membership of the college for a period of 3 years. And I applied for that knowing that I would be leaving Edinburgh, and that it would be appropriate for me to find a new kind of academic home for the time being. And that has been a very successful relationship. It's a long-term relationship in which I've been actively involved in assisting the college, because it really was the foundation of my interdisciplinarity, very much so. And I've been working with them and their development office to try and assist them with various projects. But I'm very, very keen, given my experience and my enthusiasm for Canadian studies, to find a new role in Canadian studies leadership. And the role at McGill is absolutely ideal for me in terms of my vitae and my experience to date, and I believe I could make a significant contribution.
So, Ines, you gave up your senior lectureship in the School of Social and Political Science when you gave up the directorship of Canadian Studies?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Are there other questions from the McGill end?
There was not tenure, just so you know, that there was not a system of tenure the way there is in the
yes, great.
Yeah.
Michael, do you have questions?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Timpson. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a bit of a cyclist, so I'd like to explore that further, and one of my bucket list things to cycle across the country one day. I think I may be running out of time, but I wanted to ask you about the annual conferences. You indicated that you would consider that still to be one of your priorities. I'm just curious as to what you see as the value of such conferences, and how what your objectives are when you set them up, and what your measure of success is. So what are you trying to do with them, and how do you know whether you succeed?
Yeah, okay. I think that's a really interesting question. That I think that the value of MISC conferences, of which I'm well aware, is that they have an impact on the broader public policy agenda in Canada, in Quebec and more broadly. But they're also very much so galvanizing conferences for bringing academics and commentators together as well. And I use the example of the 1997 conference because, to the best of my understanding, you had about 900 people attending that conference. And I think MISC can make a real impact on public policy debate through that kind of conference. Now, in terms of objectives, I think you have to be realistic that objectives of conferences sometimes don't go quite the way you expect them to. And I had experience of this at Edinburgh in organising First Nations First Thoughts, and also in organising Canada as Refuge, the conferences I organised there. And in the first case, where I had really asked the questions that I had asked, that I addressed in the edited collection about how can we look at the impact of First Nations thinking on Canadian society and Canadian institutions, it was quite difficult to get paper givers and paper proposers to actually focus on that question rather than on a broader reaction to this very contentious publication, First Nations Second Thoughts, that had been published by and written by Tom Flanagan. So some of those times you have to deal with that kind of dynamic. So one of the things I had to do in that conference was let that debate, which was a really interesting debate, and caused a big response, and that's success in itself. Let that debate go on in the conference. But in the edited collection that comes after it, keep your focus on mind of how are you going to make a contribution to the literature by actually dealing with the questions you wanted to deal with first of all. And I found it very interesting too in the Conference on Canada as Refuge, which is an example of how I've organised conferences which are outside my area of expertise, and I would do that at MISC. But it was very, very interesting to see how people talked about that in terms of immigration and migration and humanitarian issues. They didn't think, for example, about questions of refuge in terms of shelter, housing, social policy agendas, women's refuges, kind of domestic questions, domestic refuge questions that might apply to Canada. So one of my jobs as conference director, which I think was important in the keynote opening address that I gave at that conference, was to raise the questions that were not being addressed at that conference and to raise those questions and ask why. And I think measures of success are about the immediate and the developing and the long-term impact of conferences. And I must say that I'm very proud of the long-term impact of First Nations First Thoughts. It continues to sell well at UBC Press, and it has made an impact on, I think, a number of courses in Canada, and also it attracted graduate students to the centre. So I think trying to think about how you measure success beyond that, beyond the conference itself, is important.
Thank you. Michael, did you have a follow-up or another question?
I don't know how quite to formulate this one. We're in an interesting period in the Canada-Quebec dialogue. You mentioned that, and I'm just wondering.
Hello.
Michael, we lost you there. Can you start again?
Yeah. Okay. I was just asking about Quebec-Canada relations and the context of a very federalist Quebec premier, a new federal government, a growing relationship between Quebec and Ontario. I'm just wondering how you think that issue, which has been such a dominating one for Canada, is going to play out over these next several years.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting to see that at the moment, clearly there is a pretty, on the face of it, a developingly positive relationship between Philippe Couillard and Catherine Wynne. So I think it's very interesting to see how you have this kind of Quebec-Ontario relationship at the leadership level. And certainly, I mean, I think there's a history of trying to cultivate the relationships between Quebec and Ontario provincially in previous eras. What I think is quite interesting at the moment, and it's hard to fathom how this will go, is that although I wanted to talk and wanted to signal that an institution like MISC, because of its location, is very much at the forefront of, must be in a position to comment on Quebec's position in Canada. I think we may be at a stage at the moment where it's actually quite hard to see that as a very distinct relationship in the way that it was distinct in earlier eras. But I mean, we're in such a kind of honeymoon period, as it were, with the new Trudeau era that it is difficult to judge whether that would still continue to be the case, or whether fissures might emerge in different ways that we're not aware of happening at the moment. So I say that very cautiously, and that's why I wanted to give this sense in my comments about the fact that we need to be mindful that questions of nationalism kind of rumble on underneath the surface of the current era, and they could re-emerge, and MISC needs to be in a position to comment on those.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I don't have any questions.
If not, Ennis, thank you very, very much for your presentation. It's a pleasure to have spent some time with you, and we'll certainly be in touch. Thank you so much.
Je vous remercie de m'avoir écouté, et thank you for inviting me. And may I just say, in conclusion, that I would like to emphasize my enthusiasm for this post and the skills that I could bring to it. And if I was successful in the appointment, I would like to assure you that I would work with my characteristic energy, my enthusiasm, and my sincere interest in taking forward the broader objectives of McGill in MISC, within McGill, nationally and internationally. So merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you.